a royal summit, a fragile letter, and a room full of secrets. In a moment that shook the monarchy to its core, Prince William stood before the royal family and opened a letter written by Princess Diana just 3 days before her tragic death. As he read her final words, King Charles couldn't hold back. The tears came, the silence grew, and centuries of royal restraint shattered. You won't believe what came next. Summit in the Great Hall. Inside Buckingham Palace's Great Hall, tension hung in the air like a storm about to break. Gilded columns rose around the room as members of the royal family took their seats. Formal, quiet, unreadable. At the center stood Prince William, holding a small time-worn and, though his fingers moved slowly across the flap, almost reverent eyes locked on him. Every breath felt like it might shake the palace walls. This letter was written 3 days before her death. William began, voice steady but low. The silence in the room turned icy. Even those who had spent their lives around protocol and poise felt something shift. Charles turned his head, jaw tightening. Camilla, his hands clasped in her lap, fidgeted. She didn't look up. The letter Diana's had returned, and within the shadow of unfinished truth, the weight of the moment wasn't political, it was personal. For years the monarchy had walked carefully around Diana's memory, praising her in public while keeping her legacy tightly controlled behind the palace doors. But now William had broken that barrier, and it wasn't through scandal or rebellion. It was through her own words, the kind no royal could spin or deny. "This is not just a letter," he said softly. "It's her voice. Her final voice." The entire room, Charles, Camilla's senior aides, sat frozen. This wasn't a speech. This was the beginning of a reckoning. The Great Hall wasn't just regal anymore. It was emotional, vulnerable, and for the first time in years, truly human. But what did Diana actually write? What words had she saved for her son in her final days? What truth did she leave behind, waiting for the right moment? Up next, the letter is read aloud. A mother's love, a father's plea for forgiveness, and a message that could heal or reopen every royal wound. Reading Diana's final words, William held the letter carefully, his thumb pressed against a faint crease in the paper. The room didn't move, not even the guards. "My darling William," he read, and in that instant it wasn't a summit. It was a son reading his mother's final thoughts. Her handwriting, her voice, her love. Alive again, for everyone to hear. The words flowed softly. "Never forget who you are, and forgive your father." The room's temperature seemed to drop. Charles shifted in his chair, eyes blinking rapidly. 4 years his grief had been private, guarded, but now the wounds Diana once carried had found their way back to him. On paper, in front of his family. It wasn't angry, it wasn't bitter, it was gentle. "Love will always carry you through," Diana had written. Her tone was full of grace, not politics, not accusation, just a mother guiding her son through a future she wouldn't see, and in doing so she left a blueprint, not for power, but for peace. As William folded the letter, his hands trembled slightly. He didn't need to say anything more. Diana already had her words, weren't just memory, they were direction, forgiveness, compassion, legacy. For a moment, the monarchy wasn't about titles or duties. It was about a mother's final hope carried forward by the son she left behind. But emotions can't be contained forever, and no royal gathering can escape fallout. As the weight of Diana's words sinks in, something breaks, and it's not silence. It's Charles. For the first time, the king shows something more powerful than leadership. He shows pain, and what follows is unforgettable. Emotional fallout. The room was still, but William's voice had unlocked something deep. A single tear slid down Charles's cheek. He didn't wipe it away. His lips quivered, his hands, normally held in royal composure, trembled slightly in his lap. This wasn't the king. This was a man. A father, facing the ghost of his past. In that one moment, centuries of royal restraint shattered. "I didn't know she wrote that," Charles whispered almost to himself. The words weren't for the room, but they echoed. His eyes welled again. You could feel his heart cracking open. The man known for his distance now sat completely exposed, no crown, no armor, just regret. Camilla, seated beside him, looked frozen. Her eyes darted to the floor, then quickly to the letter. Her jaw tightened, but her expression stayed unreadable. Was it guilt? Was it fear? Or was it simply shock? She said nothing, and in that silence everyone else started to feel the weight. Aides at the back exchanged glances. Some looked down, unsure where this emotional storm would go. The message had landed, not just the words, but the truth behind them. This wasn't about scandal or revenge. This was about a family long held together by duty finally being forced to feel. And as Charles sat there, eyes red, shoulders slumped, one truth became clear: Diana had spoken again. And this time, the world was listening. But how did Diana know this day might come? What made her write a letter with such precision and care? The answer lies in the past, hidden in a whisper, sealed in an envelope, and protected by the one man she trusted most. Coming up, the flashback that changes everything. Diana's secret. It was late evening at Kensington Palace. The lights were dimmed, the staff minimal. Diana stood by her writing desk, a soft cardigan wrapped around her. She held the envelope in her hand, sealed, an address not to William or to her butler. She whispered something to him, so serious. "If it ever comes to this, make sure he sees it." The voiceover echoes across decades. Diane, his voice tender, mature. "There may come a day when they need the truth. Not through headlines, not through scandals, or through my words." That night she gave her butler the letter and a mission. It wasn't about revenge. It was about love finding its way, no matter how late. We see images of Diana that history rarely shows: thoughtful, strategic, aware. She wasn't naive. She knew her story could be twisted, erased, or buried under royal silence. So she planned ahead, not just for William, but for Charles, for the institution, for the legacy she believed in. She didn't scream for justice. She planted seeds for healing. That letter, buried for more than 2 decades, wasn't a coincidence. It was destiny. Diana didn't just live a public life, she left behind a private truth, and now that truth had arrived exactly when it was needed most. Or foresight wasn't dramatic, it was powerful, it was emotional intelligence in its purest form. But destiny doesn't come without cost. For Charles, Diana's return through that letter wasn't just a message, it was a mirror. What he saw reflected back was painful. What comes next is the moment we never expected to see. The king breaks, not in rage, but in raw, quiet collapse. Get ready to witness the most human moment of his reign. Charles's breakdown. The camera zoomed in slowly, his eyes read, his jaw trembling. Charles sat motionless in his chair, the letter still echoing in his mind. His shoulders slumped, breath uneven. Then, finally, it came, a tear full and unhidden rolled down his cheek. The room didn't move. He wasn't King Charles at that moment. He was just Charles. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words failed, his lips pressed together. The grief he had managed for years, sometimes hidden, sometimes hardened, was now in full view. He didn't sob, but the heartbreak was there. He wasn't crying for the crown. He was crying for her, for Diana, for the past, and maybe even for himself. His aides, usually trained to stay composed, glanced nervously. One stepped forward, then stopped. What do you do when you are monarch? Weeks. No guidebook covers this, but the moment was real. And for once it felt like honesty had broken through the marble walls of monarchy. No script, no royal statement, just human emotion. Public tears from a king are rare, but they are powerful. This wasn't a PR moment. It wasn't for the cameras. It was what happens when the weight of history and guilt become too much. And for Charles, this breakdown wasn't weakness. It was the first crack in a fortress that had stood untouched for decades. But while tears flowed from a father, the next words came from a mother through her son. Diane, his voice wasn't done yet. There was one more message, and this one carried not just emotion, but peace. In the next scene, forgiveness takes the stage, and what's said could change everything moving forward. A mother's compassion. William looked down at the final part of the letter, his voice soft. She wanted peace, even after the pain. The room, still soaked in emotion, went even quieter. This wasn't just closure, it was a turning point. Diana hadn't written to blame. She had written to forgive and know that forgiveness was filling the great hall. She wanted you to be better, William added gently, looking toward his father. The words weren't harsh, they were hopeful. For all the chaos Diana had faced, her last wish wasn't revenge, it was unity. That message hit deeper than any title ever could. Even the aides began to lower their guard. This wasn't scandal. It was healing. Diana became more than memory in that moment. She became a guide. Even in death, she reached across generations to remind her family who they were meant to be. Legacy through love, William repeated, echoing her exact words, and suddenly the conflict didn't feel like a battle anymore. It felt like a chance, maybe the last one. And seated near the edge, nodded quietly. Camilla turned slightly toward William. Even Charles raised his eyes again, still misty, but no longer shattered. For the first time in years, Diane, his name wasn't being spoken in whispers, it was being read aloud with love and clarity. Not to destroy, but to rebuild. But rebuilding is never simple, especially when past tensions still simmer in silence. And one royal's silence is deafening. Camilla, her presence, her posture, or stillness, it all begs the question, what role does she really playing in this family story? Coming up, we decode Camilla's silence and what it might be hiding. Camilla's silent presence. Camilla sat upright, but her shoulders were tied. Her face was frozen in a kind of quiet shock. No tears, no anger, just stillness. But her eyes told another story. She avoided looking at WM. She never met Charles. His gaze she seemed there for. Physically, but emotionally she was somewhere far away. Her silence wasn't calm, it was loaded. Every camera angle that caught her face showed something different. Some saw guilt, others read defiance. Was she bracing herself for judgment, or quietly refusing to be part of this public reckoning? No words came from her, but her sighed and said more than any statement could. She didn't nod, she didn't smile, she didn't flinch. Royal aides at the side exchanged subtle glances. This wasn't the supportive partner Camilla had tried to become over 2 decades. This was the woman whose presence still sparked division. Some viewers watching the summit live tweeted, "She looks like a guest at her own trial." Another post read, "She knows exactly what that letter meant and what it left unsaid." Was she an obstacle to reconciliation or a reluctant witness to it? That's the question now circling inside and outside the palace. Because Diana's words were about love, forgiveness, unity, but Camilla, his presence cast a long, complicated shadow, one that even time and titles hadn't fully raised. And in her silence, the future of that reconciliation felt suddenly uncertain. But while Camilla stayed quiet, one connection quietly reignited between brothers once thought irreparably broken. They didn't speak, but they didn't need to. In our next chapter, a single glance, a shared grief, and the question that's been haunting everyone: could Diana's letter bring William and Harry back together? Let's find out the brothers react. William folded the letter carefully, placing it back in the envelope like a sacred artifact. He took a breath, glanced to his left, and for just a moment, looked toward the doorway. Harry wasn't in the room, but he was watching, we're told, from a nearby chamber. And when their eyes met through the open archway, it said everything. For years, tension had to find them words unsaid, wounds unhealed. But in that glance, brief, honest, wrong, there was something different. William's face softened. Harry's eyes looked glassy. No words exchanged, but you didn't need them for a moment. They were just sons, not princes, not headlines. Just Diana's boys holding the same grief. Charles didn't react, but Age noticed. One royal staffer whispered, "It's the first time they've acknowledged each other like that in years." The moment passed quickly, but it mattered. Maybe Diana's words didn't just heal old wounds, they reopened a connection once thought gone. Whether it was enough, still unclear. But the bridge was no longer broken, it had a foundation, and that glance lit up the world. Social media exploded. William and Harry locked eyes. Could this be the start of peace? Photos were shared, polls were launched, and for the first time in months the public didn't argue, they hoped, because deep down everyone wanted what Diana wanted, not just forgiveness but family. But while eyes were on the brothers, the outside world was already so. Pinning headlines, hashtags, breaking news. The monarchy's most vulnerable moment had become its most watched. In our next act, we leave the Great Hall and dive into the firestorm outside, where the press, the public, and the power of perception threatened to rewrite the royal story. Public and press reaction within minutes. The media had a frenzy on their hands. King breaks down over Diana's letter, blared one headline. Princes reunite through tears, read another. News anchors scrambled to update their scripts. Every network carried footage from the summit, the BBC, ITV, Sky. Every station locked into one story. It wasn't a scandal, it was a moment. Social media lit up. The hashtag Diane words trended globally within 20 minutes. People shared memories, photos, even old clips of Diana hugging her sons. Some tweeted, "She's still guiding them even now." Others shared clips of Charles crying. "I never thought I'd feel for him like this," one post said. Sympathy surged in real time. Pundits weighed in instantly. Some said, "Was the most human moment in recent royal history." Others questioned the timing. Did William plan this? One commentator asked. But overall something shifted. The monarchy, long viewed as cold and distant, had suddenly bled publicly, emotionally, and people responded not with mockery but with empathy. Polls showed a spike in favorability for William Charles. His numbers rose slightly to mostly from older viewers, but what really moved people, the message, "Legacy through love," became a headline quote. Diana in death had sparked a conversation no press machine could have manufactured. And the question now, could the monarchy carry that message forward, or would they retreat? But back inside the palace, that question was already causing panic. Emotional openness is powerful but dangerous. The firm's traditions weren't built to handle terse letters and personal truths. In the next chapter, the palace goes into crisis mode. Because behind the beauty of a breakthrough lies the fear of losing control, institutional reckoning. Inside palace walls, alarms weren't sounding, but they might as well have been. The comms team had barely caught their breath when the full weight of the summit hit. "We need to respond fast," said one senior aide. The emotion had spilled out publicly. The crown's composure, its most guarded asset, was cracked, and tradition didn't have a playbook for this. Meetings were called at lightning speed. Old school advisors demanded silence, while younger strategists called for transparency. "We can't pretend this didn't happen once," said. People saw the king cry. But that was exactly what the monarchy had avoided for decades. Human messiness. Now it was everywhere. On screens, on papers, on timelines, some pushed for reform. Make space for real emotions, show them we're evolving. Others want to damage control. Don't let Diana's letter define the monarchy. The conflict wasn't just emotional, it was generational. Could the palace adapt its stiff upper lip, or would it harden again, afraid of change? The stakes were enormous. Keep the monarchy-related bull or risk becoming irrelevant. For now, no statement came, but aides whispered of upcoming changes, more open appearances, possible interviews, acknowledgement of Diana's message. But under all the spin, one fear. I lingered. What happens when truth touches the throne? Because once people see what's real, they may never accept the polished version again. But for Charles, the crisis wasn't just professional, it was personal. Because he had held on to that letter for over 20 years, kept it hidden, protected, or buried Diana's words. Why was it guilt? Was it fear? In our next chapter, we face Charles, his secret, and it just might be the most painful truth of all. Charles' dilemma. Alone in his private quarters, Charles held the original letter again, creased, yellowed, and deeply familiar. He hadn't seen it in years, but he'd never forgotten it. He was the one who locked it away. The question now echoed louder than ever. Would he hide his late wife's final words from their son for so long? Some say he did it to protect William from pain, from confusion, from the pressures of royalty. Others believe it was fear that Diana's voice would overshadow his rule, fear that her grace would forever compete with his authority. The truth, it was probably both. And now he couldn't run from it. The moment he watched William read those words aloud, something inside him broke. Not from shock, but from shame. He had carried this secret for over 2 decades, believing he was doing the right thing. But Diana's boy still reached her son without his permission. And now the world knew she had trusted William more than anyone else. Charles sat silently, staring out the window. Was I loyal to my crown or to my family? He asked himself. The answer wasn't clear. But what was clear was the cost. The cost of silence, of control, of years spent hiding instead of healing. And now, with that letter free, the crown weighed heavier than ever. But Charles isn't the only one at a crossroads. William and Harry now stand face to face with their mother's final message, but will it bring them closer or push them even further apart? The next chapter is a defining moment in royal brotherhood, because the question is no longer if they can unite, but if they even want to. Brothers at the crossroads. The brothers met in a quiet corridor after the summit ended. No cameras, no audience, just the heavy stillness between them. Williamsburg first. She wanted peace, he said. Harry nodded, arms crossed. She always did. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't warm, but it was real. A conversation that had waited years to happen now unfolding quietly. Their lives had taken opposite paths. One stayed, one left. One followed duty. One followed heart. But for the first time they weren't debating their choices, they were reflecting on their pain. You blamed me for leaving, Harry said. William looked down. I blamed you for making it harder to stay. It wasn't an argument, it was truth. They talked about Diana, about childhood, about the letter, about how even now her presence was stronger than ever. She wanted us together, William said. But not at any cost, Harry replied. And there it was, the divide. They loved the same mother, but they saw her legacy differently. And the monarchy, it stood between them. Still, they didn't reconcile, not fully, but they didn't walk away angry either. It was a start, a handshake, a look that said, we're not done yet. And for 2 brothers carrying the world's expectations, that single quiet moment felt louder than any public statement. It wasn't unity, but it wasn't goodbye either. But now the weight of Diana's words falls on the entire monarchy. Will the crown listen to